Wow. Thanks. Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to this evening's conversation on predatory lending, today's debt slavery, which has been organized by the Center for Public Justice and hosted by Covenant College. My name is Derek Halverson. I serve as the president here at Covenant, for those who don't know, and it's my distinct privilege and pleasure to introduce tonight's event. As Christians, we are called to seek the welfare of the city to which we've been called, and to care for the widow and the orphan and the alien in our midst. These biblical obligations apply not only to individual acts of charity, but also to how we address societal structures and matters of public concern. This evening, I'm pleased to welcome several friends from the Center for Public Justice as they talk to us about their new book, Unleashing Opportunity: Why Escaping Poverty Requires a Shared Vision of Justice. Tonight we hope to explore both how to present and how to live out a common good vision of opportunity informed and shaped by our Christian faith. In Unleashing Opportunity, Michael Gerson, Stephanie Summers, and Katie Thompson explore 5 key issues that are taking a disproportionate and devastating toll on low-income Americans. These are early childhood development, the foster care to sex trafficking pipeline, juvenile justice, the graduation gap, and predatory payday lending. For each topic, Gerson puts a lens on the magnitude of the problem, Summers applies a biblical justice framework for considering solutions, and Thompson tells the stories of our neighbors who have experienced these issues firsthand. Tonight's event focuses on one of the 5 chapters in the book, Predatory Payday Lending. We'll have opportunity to hear a keynote address from Michael Gerson, after which we'll have a panel discussion moderated by Stephanie Summers, the CEO of the Center for Public Justice. So before we begin, a bit of background on tonight's keynote speaker. Michael Gerson joined the Center for Public Justice as a fellow in 2011. He's a nationally syndicated columnist who appears twice weekly in the Washington Post and in nearly 100 other newspapers, including our own Chattanooga Times Free Press. Mr. Gerson is the author of Heroic Conservatism, the co-author of City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era, and most recently, as you just heard, co-author of the Center for Public Justice's new book, Unleashing Opportunity: Why Escaping Poverty Requires a Shared Vision of Justice. He serves as a senior advisor for ONE. He serves on the Initiative for Global Development Leadership Council, and he serves on the boards of the U.S. Center for Global Leadership, the News Literacy Project, and the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. He is the 2015 Pamela and Jack Egan Visiting Professor at Duke University. He appears regularly on the PBS NewsHour, Face the Nation, and other television programs. Until 2006, Mr. Gerson was a top aide to President George W. Bush as assistant to the president for policy and strategic planning. He was a key administration advocate for the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, the president's malaria initiative, the fight against global sex trafficking, and funding for women's justice and empowerment issues. Prior to that appointment, he served in the White House as deputy assistant to the president and director of presidential speechwriting, and assistant to the president for speechwriting and policy advisor. Mr. Gerson joined Bush's presidential campaign in early 1999 as chief speechwriter and a senior policy advisor. Prior to that, he served as a senior editor covering politics at U.S. News and World Report. He was a speechwriter and policy advisor for Jack Kemp and a speechwriter for Bob Dole during the 1996 presidential campaign. He's also served as Senator Dan Coates of Indiana as policy director. Mr. Gerson is a graduate of Wheaton College in Illinois. He grew up in the St. Louis area, where he attended Westminster Christian Academy. We may have some Westminster folks in the room tonight. And he now lives with his wife and sons in Northern Virginia. That's the official bit. I want to add one other bit. I heard this afternoon from Covenant College alumnus Mike Cromarty, who is vice president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And he tells me that the late Christopher Hitchens once told him that Michael Gerson is the best literary stylist writing in the Washington Post today. I can't decide if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it was something that Christopher Hitchens said about Michael Gerson, which was really wonderful. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope that through the keynote lecture that you hear and the panel discussion that we will all come away not only with a deeper passion to promote opportunity, but also a clearer sense of how biblical truth should inform that passion and how we can together pursue a shared vision of justice. So would you please join me this evening in offering a warm Covenant Scots and Chattanooga welcome to Mr. Michael Gerson.
Thank you so much. It really is a pleasure to be with you. First time I've been to this beautiful campus. I asked my friend Mike Cromarty, who went here, what his greatest memory was. And he said finding his wonderful wife, Jenny, that you hear, which is the only right answer when your wife is present, I promise you. But that's often true, and I've found in Christian education, people really develop lifelong ties. I talk to my Wheaton roommate just about once a week. I made connections with teachers that lasted for decades. And I really strongly believe in Christian liberal education, the development of a critical mind and a well-grounded worldview, and hopefully a belief or sense of social justice. This was certainly the case for the great evangelicals of the 18th and 19th centuries who struggled against slavery and confronted the destructive side effects of the Industrial Revolution. There's a story I like about Lord Shaftesbury, who's someone you should know about if you don't, the great English Christian reformer. After visiting and praying with a very tough group of convicts, one asked him, "But will you ever come to see us again?" Shaftesbury replied, "Yes, at any time and at any place, whenever you shall send for me." That is the proper attitude of a Christian personalism, a belief in human rights and dignity. "I feel my business lies in the gutter," said Shaftesbury, "and I have not the least intention to get out of it." Tonight I want to talk a bit about what a Christian calling to social justice means in our time, particularly in the area, this specific area of policy, the economic exploitation of the poor through payday lending. But let me tell you just a little bit about myself first. I didn't take the typical Washington path. I studied theology at Wheaton College, which was a pretty religiously conservative place, at least at the time. When I went there, the joke on campus was that the administration had banned premarital sex because it might lead to dancing. I was headed for a THD at Fuller Theological Seminary when I got a call from Chuck Colson, who asked me to meet him at the O'Hare Airport. I don't know how many of you have been exposed to Chuck, but he was sent some of my writing, and he asked me to help him as a researcher on a book called Kingdoms in Conflict. Chuck was one of the great social reformers of the 20th century, comparable to someone like Shaftesbury. The treatment of prisoners, our attitude towards prisoners, is really a test of our commitment to human dignity and the possibility of grace. And I saw examples of men and women who had done terrible things and were closer to God than I could ever hope to be. At Prison Fellowship, I also saw the essential role that religious institutions play in our common life. Prison Fellowship was doing things, touching the need for meaning and healing and broken families that no government program could do. When I went into government as a policy advisor in the U.S. Senate, my goal was to find ways to promote the work of private and religious charities, to bring them to scale without changing their nature and religious distinctives. This is an effort that became known as compassionate conservatism. In the late 1990s, there were two politicians, my boss, Senator Dan Coates, and Texas Governor George W. Bush, who called themselves compassionate conservatives. And in 1999, I went to work for Bush's presidential campaign. From the start, we were a little bit of an odd couple. He is outgoing, social, athletic, likable, and I'm actually none of those things. He has a penchant for locker room humor that makes me uncomfortable. I remember after one session at the governor's mansion, in Austin when everyone had gone but me, and the governor had some time before his next appointment. He asked me, "Do you want to hang out for a little while?" With a rudeness that now seems crazed, I replied, "Not really," which is not the way to treat a future president. But I came to respect Bush as a politician and as a person. He is, above all, a man without a mask. Interest, frustration, boredom come unfiltered to his face. He is kind and loyal to the people around him. And he can occasionally be sharp-tongued. Every year on the day of the State of the Union address, the president sits down with all the network anchors for a time of question and answer. At one of those sessions, I remember, the late Peter Jennings asked him, "What does it feel like to go before the nation and read someone else's words?" The president immediately replied, "You do it every night." My life changed direction on September 11th, 2001, like the lives of many people. I was working from home. The president was in Florida when my deputy, who was watching events in New York, said I should come in immediately. I was just thinking of this as I saw the images of Paris. I was headed into work on a clear morning down Interstate 395 when I saw a plane flying low over the highway headed toward the Pentagon, so low that I could see the windows. Days later, I sat in the National Cathedral for the memorial service, and I saw in a few historical moments how the words, the rhetoric, can really matter to the country. The president said, "This world he created is of moral design. Grief and tragedy and hatred are only for a time. Goodness, remembrance, and love have no end. And the Lord of life holds all who die and all who mourn." The pace of those years, including 9/11 and war and natural disaster, was at times exhausting. It has a cost to your health. In December of 2004, while working on the president's second inaugural address, I had a heart attack at 39 years old. The president's doctor had me checked into the hospital under an assumed name to avoid all the press calls. And adding insult to incapacity, there wasn't a single call. And it has a cost to your family. During the heat of the 2004 presidential campaign, my little boy Nicholas, who was then 6 years old, announced to me in the car that he wanted John Kerry for president. When I asked him why, he said, "So you can be home on weekends." My 9-year-old, who was a little more practical, then said, "But how would we eat?" I told him I think I could get a job, maybe at a think tank. And he asked, of course, what's a think tank? So I told him, well, it's people who read and speak and have meetings and things. And Bucky, and this is true, said, "You mean they don't do anything?" After the 2004 election, my job at the White House changed significantly. I became a policy advisor to the president, focused on global health, development, genocide, areas where my interests had been leading me for some years. And I saw something very hopeful. In one of the bitterest times of partisanship in modern history, I also found a number of issues where members of both parties and people of every ideology had come together. As part of my job at the White House, I worked with conservative and liberal groups to fight global AIDS and to confront malaria and to oppose global sex trafficking and to fight the crisis in Darfur. And I've gotten to see some odd alliances grow over the years. I've gotten to know Bono of U2 pretty well. Several years ago, he invited me to the first rock concert a Wheaton kid had ever attended, that I had ever attended as a Wheaton kid. And I was thoroughly corrupted. Soon afterwards, my wife and I had dinner with Bono, who is a very idealistic and principled man. After dinner, my wife told me, "You may be idealistic and principled, but it would also be nice if you were rich and cool." Now I'm a twice-weekly columnist at the Washington Post. I spent some time at the One campaign, focused on global health and preventable disease. And I'm a fellow at CPJ, the Center for Public Justice, really a unique and important institution that Stephanie Chalmers leads, who's here tonight. CPJ brings a nonpartisan, faith-informed perspective to public policy. It's doing great work, particularly on campuses across the country. I've been honored to be associated with CPJ over the years and was honored to play a small part in producing Unleashing Opportunity, which we intend as an introduction to the idea of social justice and to the importance of public policy more generally. Stephanie and Katie Thompson are really the ones that tell the stories in the book, that make the issues real in the book. Tonight, I'm just going to provide a little context before we have our panel. I don't intend to summarize all the arguments of the book, which you can read for yourself, but I do want to say something about our audience and our fundamental social problem, which I hope sparks a discussion today. I spend a significant amount of my time on college campuses, both Christian and non-sectarian. And many young adults, in my experience, have become libertarians by default. They see only dysfunction in Washington, and they are tempted to give up on politics completely. In Unleashing Opportunity, we are trying to make the case politics isn't everything, but it matters. And the solution to our social challenges needs to be shared between government at every level, citizens, and the community, including religious institutions that serve and humanize our society. My broad topic that I want to talk about is opportunity, which feels fragile and failing for many Americans. I think this fear of lost opportunity is driving much of the anger in our politics we see today. The Tea Party blames oppressive government. Donald Trump blames foreigners and stupid politicians. The hard left blames economic elites. There seems to be a lot of blame going around. I hope eventually people tire of this negativity and serious voices of positive reform can rise above the din. Our social reality is more complex than the ideologies and demagogues will admit. Seeing our problems clearly will require most of us to challenge some of our own assumptions about America. America has a number of pressing social problems. We face an entitlement crisis. We face an economic challenge of slow growth and competitive pressure. But we also face a social crisis, growing divisions of class that threaten the American ideal and might make all of our challenges more complex. I've been influenced in these matters by Bob Putnam of Harvard University, who has really advanced our understanding of American social problems. Putnam is playing the essential role of reintroducing America to itself, and the experience is unpleasant. A nation once divided by North and South has become bifurcated by lines of class. A single society has become two different worlds of opportunity. One is the world of the educated and wealthy, characterized by greater family stability, economic prospects, and community cohesion. The wealthy live in places with better schools, increasingly segregated from the working class. Parents have greater ability to invest time, including early childhood interaction. When schools aren't living up to expectations, there are tutors. When children get into trouble, as children of every background manage to do, there are lawyers, psychologists, and addiction treatment counselors. In this world, children are more likely to participate in extracurricular activities and church-related groups where they learn important social skills. They are more likely to be situated in a circle of adults beyond their family, which can help with advice, internships, and jobs. The world of the working class, in contrast, often features economic stagnation, family instability, and community breakdown. Large economic trends, particularly globalization and the technological revolution, have pushed the blue-collar economy in many places into a permanent slump. Wages have stagnated or declined. Workforce participation has fallen. At the same time, the connection between childbearing and marriage has been broken. Chronically stressed parents, often single parents, have less time and resources to invest in their children. Community institutions, including public schools, are weak, providing children with fewer extracurricular opportunities. When children get into trouble, there is no support structure of addiction treatment and legal help. As Bob Putnam puts it, the airbags do not deploy. The best social scientific research of our time indicates the need for children to be located in strong family and social networks, but those networks are rapidly declining in the working class, and the result is a class divide that cannot be tolerated in America without doing violence to our social ideals. Americans are generally comfortable with the existence of inequality in a free economy as long as economic advancement is a realistic goal. But economic inequality without economic mobility is really just a caste system in which birth is destiny. This problem is an economic challenge. We're talking about perhaps a third of the American workforce coming from circumstances that do not prepare them for participation in a modern economy. And the problem is a moral challenge. In a class-based society, the most important choice you ever make is the choice of who your parents are, which is not really a choice at all. This is a good definition of social injustice, massive disadvantage without doing anything to deserve it. To put matters bluntly, if income inequality is the main economic problem, it could be solved tomorrow through confiscation and redistribution. If the main problem is unequal generation of social and human capital in institutions such as families, schools, and neighborhoods, the solutions become more difficult. One task can be accomplished by a tax collector. The other is the work of a community. So the arguments of unleashing opportunity, in my view, you can ask the other participants for their views, amount to a kind of faith-based communitarianism, a belief that justice is not always achieved by markets and can't always be achieved by government alone. I think this space is occupied by the Reformed Kuyperian tradition, which has been central to the history of CPJ, the tradition of sphere sovereignty, if you're familiar with that tradition. And I think this space is occupied by the tradition of Catholic social thought, the tradition of solidarity and subsidiarity. But I hope the book is not as boring as the summary I just gave. It really is oriented towards serious analysis and incremental solutions in a variety of areas that might bring political consensus. Early childhood interventions, foster care reform, juvenile justice reform, closing the graduation gap. But let me focus a few minutes on just one of those issues that I've written a lot about recently. There are a set of related policy matters that are not ideologically divisive or should not be, that dramatically would help the poor. How about choosing to help the poor by refusing to cheat them? There is a broad and growing collaboration between government and private businesses to systematically defraud and exploit the poor through state lotteries, payday gambling, and our main topic, payday lending. The lottery is an awful example of political corruption. Here, government is raising revenue by selling the Powerball dream of wealth without work. Studies in a number of states have shown that lottery tickets sales are concentrated in poor communities, that poor people spend a larger portion of their income on tickets, and that the poor are more likely to view the lottery as an investment. This could be your ticket out, promises one typical billboard in a distressed Chicago neighborhood. Think on this a moment. In a place where government has utterly failed to provide adequate education and public services, government is using advertising to exploit the desperation of poor people in order to raise revenue that funds other people's public services. This is often called a regressive form of taxation. The word does not adequately capture the cruelty and crookedness of selling a lie to vulnerable people in order to bilk them. Offering the chance of 1 in 100 million is the equivalent of a lie. Lotteries depend on the deceptive encouragement of mythical thinking and fantasies of escape. A second area where business and government in many states have entered into a full partnership is payday gambling, moving gaming out of destination resorts and into malls and riverboats closer to middle-class and working-class gamblers. State governments raise money by taxing revenue generated by slot machines that are really sophisticated computers designed to encourage people to enter the zone and play to extinction. Compulsive behavior is the intended goal of the software program, and thus the intended goal of state legislators who would rather encourage addiction than ask the broader public for taxes. Another form of financial predation against the poor, and this one is entirely in the private sector, is payday lending. I know you're probably familiar with the storefronts here in Tennessee. They seem to be everywhere. There is, by one resort I read, more payday storefronts here in Chattanooga than there are Starbucks. There are more of them in America than McDonald's franchises. In theory, payday lenders offer small loans of a few $100s without credit checks or hassles to cover emergency cash flow needs, maybe a medical deductible or a broken air conditioner. In practice, lenders make their money on repeat borrowers who use loans for regular expenses and end up paying massive interest rates, often in the triple digits. Many people take out loans from one company in order to pay for loans from another company and often get behind in their payments. Others will go into more detail about the local situation here, but Tennessee caps effective annual interest rates on payday loans at 459%, and it limits to 3 outstanding loans at one time. Imagine an honest advertisement offering a loan for 459% yearly. This is what used to be called usury. It is now a $46 billion industry with considerable political clout, selling a financial product to the poor that encourages debt servitude. Yes, there is a real need for short-term, small-dollar credit in America that our current banking system does not meet. Yes, it would be better if people were financially literate, though it is not just a problem of the poor, by the way. But this is a business that structures its loans in a way where they are almost never paid in the 2-week period of the loan. The fees and interest are often rolled into new loans. The profit in this industry is made by heavy use. In one study, users of payday lending are indebted for an average of 5 months out of every year. In short, this is an industry where the profit requires abuse of the product. It is a trap, designed to be a trap. Some payday lenders are open 24 hours a day because all of us know that some of the most sound financial decisions we made are made at 3 a.m. This is one of those areas where legal solutions must be accompanied by community alternatives. If there is a need for short-term credit, then it should be churches and other institutions in the community that take up this slack and meet the need. The United States is bursting at the seams with populist energy. And here is a cause that should appeal to people on left and right. Let's stop government and businesses from treating citizens as marks and dupes in the lottery, payday gambling, and payday lending. Let's confront everyone in government and business who benefits from defrauding the poor. It's not my purpose to engage in a discussion of political philosophy tonight, but I think this is a good conservative cause as well, A community is bigger and more complex than a market and ultimately depends on virtues and values it does not create. And at the very least, the powerful in government and business should not undermine the values of its own citizens for benefit and profit. I'm sure the panel will explore this topic in a lot more detail, but I think the overarching theme of unleashing opportunity and the long-term mission of CPJ is essential. Politics is not everything. It is often disappointing and even disreputable. But like it or not, it reflects our views of human dignity. These ideals are either honored or dishonored in thousands of decisions and debates each day from Washington, D.C. to the Chattanooga School Board. This can seem overwhelming. The needs are large and often complex, but people don't need to do everything, just something. They need to choose an issue to master, stand up for a person who doesn't have a voice, pick a plot of ground to make a more decent and hopeful place. In a democracy, indifference is a form of complicity. It is also not an option for the believer called to serve the good of our neighbor as a service to God at any time and at any place, wherever God sends us. Thank you very much.
Hi there. I'm Stephanie Summers, and I'm the CEO of the Center for Public Justice. Thanks for being here. This is a wonderful crowd of people. So we're here tonight because of a book, but our real goal is to start a conversation. So I hope that what happens over the course of this evening continues into the hallways and into your churches and into your dorm rooms and your classrooms and beyond. So that is my prayer for our conversation. We're going to do a few things with the rest of our evening. I'm going to moderate a discussion between these four lovely people on our panel. So I have some questions that I've prepared for them, and we're going to discuss them. And then it's going to be your turn to ask them some questions, and we'll get some folks out here with some microphones at that point so you can ask questions as well. So let me go ahead and introduce who we have. You've already heard from Mike. To Mike's left is Katie Thompson, who edits Shared Justice, which is the Center for Public Justice's online journal for young adults. So if you haven't seen that yet, check it out. Next to Katie is Stephen Reeves, who is the Associate Coordinator of Partnerships and Advocacy for the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. And Stephen and Katie are both representing an organization called Faith for Just Lending, which is a coalition of faith groups that are working on the anti-predatory lending movement. And then to Stephen's left is Mark Bowers, who's probably familiar to some of you. Mark is the curriculum specialist here for the Chalmers Center. So we're really glad to have each of these folks with us tonight. I'm going to start by asking each of you, and Mark, maybe we can start with you and work our way this way. If you could talk a little bit about how you were first introduced to predatory lending.
Good question. If you're like me, you were taught perhaps to recognize sin and brokenness in yourself, maybe from a young age, when studying the Bible, to see it in other people as well, but not always to recognize it in systems that end up oppressing folk. If you're like me, you might hear the plenary talk here and think, but does anybody really take these loans at 458% interest? I mean, does this really exist? You might read these papers that say the average user takes 11 payday loans in a year and think, does this really happen? It wasn't for me until I moved into a low-income neighborhood here in our city in Chattanooga and befriended some local folks there. And a friend of mine, his name is Jared, let's say, he came to me and he said, I've gotten myself in a bit of trouble and I need your help. Well, he had pawned his car title and gotten himself into a very difficult situation there. And sure enough, there, buried in page 4 of the documentation, the loan terms were 458% interest, burying him into a cycle of debt or losing his car. It wasn't until this was happening to my neighbor that this became real to me as an issue.
In late 2009, I was working for an organization called the Christian Life Commission in Austin, Texas, as legislative counsel, when some organizations came to us and said, you're the type of folks that might want to look at this issue. We were known actually for years for opposing the expansion of gambling and lottery for many of the reasons Michael mentioned earlier. And as folks like the NAACP and the AARP came to us and we looked at it, we realized that Texas was in a bad situation. We started thinking of it biblically, thinking of it in Scripture, talking to some of our theology professors and writing about it in the public. And a few months later, I got a call from a pastor who had never done public policy, public witness, or advocacy before, who just said, tell me what you need to do, what I need to do. I'll show up, I'll do it. And proceeded to tell me a story where a member of his congregation took out a $700 payday loan and had paid for 4.5 months, $200 every 2 weeks, $1,800, and still owed $700. By the time the church stepped in and helped him out of that hole, which he was clearly never going to be able to get out of, they paid another $1,500. So in less than 5 months, a $700 loan cost over $3,300. It's at that point that I got very serious about this type of advocacy.
I think this is an issue that's really kind of one that's hidden in plain sight, we like to say. It certainly was for me. I had seen storefronts, but I don't think I ever really considered what's actually going on in there. I didn't know. So it wasn't until we started researching and kind of digging into this for the book project that I really became aware of what was going on. And similar to these two on my left, having conversations with borrowers who just have these unbelievable stories of walking into a payday loan storefront and being out in 15 minutes with a loan that they come back 2 weeks later and have exorbitant fees and interest rates on. The woman I profile in the book had a $500 car payment. She didn't want to go to her parents or family. She didn't want to be a bother to her church, so she went to the lender. And she came back in 2 weeks, and the loan had amassed $75 in fees. She ended up being trapped in several loans for over a year, and by the end spending over $3,000. So I think stories like that are very common, and in the book we kind of walk through what her journey looked like, and it's an amazing story, but that's how I became introduced.
I approached it as a columnist trying to write about poverty. And we have an interesting recent history, beginning in the Great Society, where we spent a significant amount of money to alleviate poverty in America. We spend about $1 trillion a year at every level of government right now. And the Great Society was very, very good for the elderly. Dramatically reduced levels of poverty, had a real positive effect on the life of the elderly, and I think a real success in many ways. But it was much less successful when it comes to young families and single parents. So I started looking at this issue as a professional interest, and there are some things we do that I regard as very positive, like EITC. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but this is a public policy that provides wage subsidies for lower scale jobs so that if you work, you're paid more. The government essentially just tax on a significant amount of money to make work pay. So we're doing all this public policy, trying to innovate to help poor people, and then you just look at a whole category of public issues where the poor are stolen from, where they're targeted. And that really is true of lotteries. It really is true of payday gambling. It's also true in the private sector when it comes to payday lending. It's true with, I think, marijuana legalization, by which this is another source of revenue by which state legislatures don't have to go to the people and actually ask for money. They just essentially encourage the corruption of their own citizens in order to profit from it. And so that has always struck me as a deeply problematic role for government, a deeply problematic role for religion, for business, and a special calling for religious people to confront.
Great, thank you. Stephen, let's start with you. So Michael, in his talk, used the word usury. That word may be familiar to some folks, particularly folks who were older than infancy, when we had strong usury laws on the books in the United States. And to really risk oversimplifying, our usury laws have been relaxed since the 1980s. But could you talk a little bit about from a biblical perspective, why payday lending in particular is modern day usury?
Sure, absolutely. Usury is not a term most of us probably heard on Sunday morning, but it is certainly biblical, and it is one of those terms that is both moral and legal. And that there's only a few of those in my estimation right now. And, you start in the Old Testament with Leviticus and Exodus, where there's clear prohibition from charging interest at all for members of your own community and on the poor. And while we've gotten away from that throughout history, the type of moral core and moral warning to charging interest, I think, still applies, in that in this case of payday lending, you have a severe power dynamic that is not equal. When someone is desperate and they're vulnerable and therefore subject to exploitation, and that's the real core moral hazard of usury, of giving someone a loan because they're desperate and you're going to profit, and it's not a mutually beneficial transaction. Clearly in Luke 4, when Jesus proclaims his mission to set free the captives, as we've heard, this is a form of debt slavery. The way the cycle of debt is created and keeps people in debt, I would say they're captured right now. And then finally, I would say for a Christian, the market does not determine morality. Just because the market will bear it doesn't mean it's okay with us. We have to be able to make a moral distinction, and the Bible and Jesus are clear about exploiting the poor.
So I think this is a theme that's familiar to Mark. I see him nodding his head. Could you talk a little bit about the work of Faith and Finances, and particularly the work that you do to equip local churches with kind of financial education materials, and the importance of that in this particular conversation?
Sure thing, Stephanie. So at the Chalmers Center, as many of you might know, we design training materials and we train churches to use them in their communities. And one of our curricula is called Faith and Finances. And basically we train facilitators in these churches to start communities around financial education using Faith and Finances. What's unique about Faith and Finances is that it's designed specifically for the realities of the working poor. As Mr. Gerson mentioned, probably a third of workers or so who are trying to navigate complex financial systems where their wages are stagnating, or jobs have been outsourced, or they are stuck in cycles of part-time labor through temp agencies. So Faith and Finances seeks to target that specific group. You know, a lot of financial education material out there, lesson 1 is get $1,000 in an emergency fund. And for the realities of low-income folks, they're not going to come back for lesson 2, you know, if that's your starting point. So we've really tried to design it with that in mind. Another unique facet of it is not just who it's targeted at, but also what the end goals are. We found in our work in training churches that financial education is really a form of discipleship. It's not just a program or a class that you teach, but it's a journey which requires relationships. And so the goal is not just wealth building, it's not just escaping material poverty, though that is perhaps one sign of God's blessing. The goal is really to ask folks at all income levels, what does it look like to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteous reign above all things, financial systems included, and our personal finances as well, and then trust that he adds everything else unto us. So again, we're trying to get at that deeper underlying heart issue that all of us, no matter how much money we have, are facing when it comes to finances.
Great, thanks. So we've seen a little bit that there's a role here for government, there's a role here for church, and there's a role here kind of for the work of business, and there's a role for, faith-based organizations in kind of addressing this issue. Why is a shared response like that needed? And this is a question for everyone, so feel free to hop in. Because, it typically, the easy solution comes from we just need to regulate, or we just need to provide more work. If the church just did the church's job, why do we need this kind of solution that takes all of these institutions into account?
I think, so Covenant's tagline is in all things Christ preeminent. Okay, I noticed that on my way in. So I think, when you're looking at this issue, in all things, what does that mean? And have you ever thought about that in the context of government, or what that means for how your faith can interact with politics? If you have, awesome. If you haven't, that's all right. But I encourage you to think about that. And I think this issue is one that doesn't allow for just one response. We've spoken with people through Faith for Just Lending, which maybe we'll talk a bit about in a few minutes, but the church and the faith community really needs to be the moral voice on this issue. It has a responsibility to be a moral authority, and that's a job that government can't necessarily do. And likewise, the government has a role that church cannot fulfill. The community bank or community faith finance institutions fulfill a role that neither government or faith community may be able to fill. So I think you really have to look at it comprehensively and see what each institution brings to the table.
Can I add one thing that's interesting from the survey data that relates to these issues? When they ask why people don't use community-based and religious-based resources, one of the main reasons that people cite is that these payday lenders are non-judgmental, okay? Which I think is a sad thing. The reason for the need for that training, I mean, in my experience, and yours is broader, there are plenty of Christians that would rather talk about their sex lives than talk about their financial lives. It's a difficult thing sometimes. So to provide this alternative, the church needs the techniques to do it, but also I thought your point about discipleship was really quite good. I mean, this is an invitation to something positive, not a kind of judgment of something negative.
I would say I think this is certainly a kind of an all-hands-on-deck necessary strategy. We heard the size of this industry. It's not going to be an overnight response by any one entity. And I think churches, for many of us, stewardship is not a foreign concept. We do talk about money to some degree in churches. Some offer financial education. Some are working on alternatives for their community. But I want to echo Katie's point that at the core of this is a moral decision. It used to be that usury was a commonly understood moral hazard, that the colonies, when this country was founded, had very strict usury limits in the nature of 8, 10, 12% per year at most. And that was because of a common understanding of the immorality of usury. Without a big discussion, without really an open dialogue, that has been changed. And I think it is the job of people of faith to get active and call the government to a moral center that says, we should be on the side of those struggling to make ends meet. We should be on the side of folks who get to the end of the month and maybe don't quite have enough. We should get back on that side and not the side of the billion-dollar industries that exploit them for profit.
We have a friend in the world of faith for just lending who talks about folks living paycheck to almost paycheck. And last year that was 12 million American families who were trapped in this debt cycle. So it's a huge issue. I wondered, Faith for Just Lending's come up a couple times, so I think if maybe Stephen and Katie, if you could both say something about Faith for Just Lending. I think it would be particularly helpful if you could talk about the role that citizens play. And let me make this connection, and then you can talk about this a little bit more. One of the challenges and why we're trying to have this conversation on college campuses is that we've got a whole bunch of young adults who have basically looked at Washington and said, a pox on both your houses. I'm out of here. I don't want to have anything to do with this. It's ugly, it's messy, it's awful. I know not Covenant students. But the reality is, if we as Christians are people who say we love our neighbor, we have to love our neighbors as citizens who work to shape a political community towards justice. So could you talk a little bit about the work that Faith for Just Lending is doing to do just that? You can fight for the mic.
Faith for Just Lending, I think, is a really exciting example of the opportunity that faith groups and citizens have to speak into this issue. So in May, I think we officially launched as a group, a coalition of 10 to 12 really diverse institutions, faith groups, denominations. We joke that these groups would not agree on anything at all theologically, but we can come together on this issue. So that's a really encouraging and exciting thing. So what we do is we kind of advocate on behalf of folks who are preyed upon, and that takes course through policy recommendations, through talking with lawmakers. We have a set of principles for just lending, which I can talk more about. So again, in all things, I'll go back to that. And if you're familiar with Kuiper or sphere sovereignty, I think these really are a good example of that. So the principles first exhort individuals to manage their finances responsibly and to be aware of their finances. It exhorts churches to be a model and to teach stewardship, similar to what Mark has been speaking about. They exhort lenders themselves to extend reasonable loans. And as Mike said, there certainly is a need for short-term loans, and there certainly is a just way to go about offering them. And lastly, exhort government to prohibit usury, as Stephen's talked about, and to defend this population.
I think one of the most important things that anyone, including young folks, could do is get to know the stories of people who have found themselves in these loans. In your mission work, wherever you serve, find out if those folks have encountered these types of loans and learn the stories. And then tell them, be a voice. You can get discouraged in this sort of work sometimes and get cynical about the role of money in politics and the influence that buys. But I believe that the right story told by the right person to the right audience at the right time can really make a difference. And right now you can collect those stories and you can talk to the city council here in Chattanooga or Lookout Mountain and figure out, is there something that can be done locally? You can speak in Nashville about what's going on at the state level, and you can certainly speak out federally at the national level to Congress, who we hope might pass an interest rate cap, or to a new agency called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, who has the authority to regulate this nationwide. all of those places need to hear from people of faith, claiming their faith and saying, look, I'm a person of faith. I volunteer here. I care here. I'm a Sunday school teacher. I'm a pastor. And this is what I've encountered in my community, and something needs to be done.
One thing I would just add on that is that while this is a national issue, currently Congress can't pass a rate cap nationally, so it really is a state and local issue also. So I would encourage you to find out what's going on in your state if you're not from here. Some states have better regulations than others. Some states have zero regulation. So really kind of investigate your own home and find out what's happening there.
Mark, I want to pivot a little bit because as we're working on this kind of piece of, okay, what's the role we play as citizens, there's also this role that we play in the community. So are there ways for folks who are in this room to be involved in the financial education work that you do?
Yeah, we offer trainings for churches several times a year for facilitators, for folks who want to get certified to teach faith and finances. You know, one interesting thing that's coming up in this conversation is it isn't just a low-income person that needs training and learning. It's also a lot of us in this room who need to learn about these issues, myself included, so that we know how to speak properly, how to engage people properly on them, and, you know, to work against this shame piece and to let the local church be a place where trust can be built and where people can open up about these things, where they will come to a local church to seek healing and guidance and not to a payday lender. Because some of those folks are pretty friendly, let me tell you. Yeah, I think starting a faith and finances community is a great first step. We really want to see churches starting these new kinds of financial conversations across income levels, where people, no matter what their background is or how much money they have or how much money they make, can start to name some of these systems and undo them in various ways. You know, I think sometimes with financial education and learning in general, we think there's this assumption that if people just hear the right information, then they'll change. But I don't know about you, but that has seldom happened for me. A lot of times change happens as a long-term relational process where people are coaching you, they're mentoring you, they're supporting you. And the church really has a competitive advantage here if we will just be the church where trust can be built, where we can tap into people's heart issues, a place where they're allowed to fail and make mistakes and have to learn things over and over again. We have in the church a place where people can experience spiritual renaissance in their finances in that dimension. And so we would invite you to join in that conversation.
Mike, and then I'm going to ask if other folks want to add after Mike's done. You have been very careful to talk about this in the context of poverty that's not just immediate, but generational poverty. We're really, Payday in particular, payday lending, is a huge robbery of not just the family of today, but family's future. Could you talk a little bit about the correlation between kind of this and generational poverty?
Well, there's a lot of writing when you're dealing with poverty, and the racial aspects of poverty and the class aspects of poverty that has to do with the wealth gap, which is not just a gap of earnings, but what you've accumulated over time and can give to your children and borrow against to create a small business, and just the ownership and resources that come with wealth creation. And something like this is the exact opposite of wealth creation. It's wealth draining. It keeps people poor over time when they can't build savings and gain the habits of economic interaction. I'll give you one example which was a sad example. But after Hurricane Katrina, when I was in government, when we were beginning to, as soon as we could, deliver benefits to people that had been dislocated, we found that many of the people we wanted to give benefits to did not have a bank account and had never had a bank account, completely disconnected from financial institutions and financial education. And we found ways to do that with ATM-like cards, and there are ways to try to get around this. But it was a pretty sad commentary, and that is a major obstacle to social mobility, not just wealth and poverty. One of the things we need to worry about is whether people can advance over time across their life and then across the generations, so their children are in a better position than they are. And this is really one of the key elements of trying to break that poverty of wealth creation.
Well, I'll just add that one of the aspects of this that you can just see in a city is a concentration of these storefronts in neighborhoods of need. And of course, that's going to correlate to usage. But if you feel like there's nowhere else to go in your neighborhood, and your mother used these and your father used these, then that sets up a pattern that can be really dangerous in a way that you don't know that this is not the mainstream financial way most people borrow. And that's really troubling. It also leads me to make a point I hadn't made yet, and that is, this is a relatively new phenomenon. This modern form of payday lending just came about in the mid-90s, 1990s. And so this is not something that has existed forever. This avoidance or exclusion to usury laws is fairly recent, and I think as time goes on and more folks become accustomed to this, the more dangerous it is.
We were in Grand Rapids a few weeks ago and heard the story of a borrower who had been in the storefront multiple times, probably over several months, and kind of her wake-up call or breaking point was when she noticed that the store clerk knew her daughter's name and was playing with her daughter in the store, and and that kind of, I think, broke her heart and made her realize that this is not something I want my daughter to think is normal, that we come here every 2 weeks and spend some time here and then we'll come back again in 2 weeks. So I think it's important to recognize that, and to even offer financial literacy courses, even as basic as they can be, to younger children also is important.
Great, thanks. When we were in Grand Rapids as well, one of these enterprising professors at the campus where we were had assigned his marketing students the assignment of visiting a Payday storefront and evaluating the marketing practices of payday lenders. And they get an A+ in terms of all the right kind of marketing. They definitely are trusted because they are very caring towards their customers. But it was interesting, Stephen, you raised this, kind of issue of concentration in a particular area. There were 4 students on the panel presenting their work to about 60 of us. And the first student presented and talked about the location and said, it was a strip mall where there were a couple stores that were abandoned, and there was a dollar store and a discount grocery and a buffet. And you could just see the other 3 students just nodding and looking at each other, because that's exactly where the stores they visited were located, in different strip malls with different buffets, discount groceries, and dollar stores. So certainly not just a concentration in particular neighborhoods, but concentrated in areas where people will go to use particular services. So definitely that component there. It's clear that there is some need for regulation in this. We've touched on a couple of those pieces. When we talk about, something like 459% APR, And then we think about things like a really crappy credit card is 22% APR. There's 459% is the middle of the pack. There are states that are absolutely unregulated. Missouri's our favorite state in this conversation always because they are in 1,950% APR, which always kind of shocks me that people actually sign that into law with that number there. So firmer regulations are key for lots of reasons, and I hope we can talk more about that. But one of the things that we've encountered in our conversation with folks who have the power to enact stronger regulations is a concern or a response that maybe is not motivated by concern. So I'd like you to maybe address the kind of two chief responses folks who are pressing for regulation here. On the one hand, there is this response that says, these people consented. They said yes. So if some of you could speak to that, how would you address that when presented with a legislative response that says they said yes? And on the other hand, a concern that I believe is a sincere concern, that there are not enough responsible credit building options available. And can you talk a little bit about what options actually already exist instead of payday loans?
I would just respond to the first one very briefly that it's one of the biggest obstacles to action in this area and other areas. It's the lazy equation of freedom with autonomy, as though they're the same thing. And it's really not the case. I mean, freedom is not the freedom to enslave yourself. It's not the freedom to exploit others. There are limits and there are definitions of what freedom means, and it's not just the absence of external restraint. And so I think there is an important, more political, philosophic issue here. If we just say, accept essentially a libertarian notion of freedom, which is letting people do whatever they want at any given moment, that's very different than I think the traditional conception of freedom in the American tradition, which requires a number of institutions in our society to work properly in order for people to achieve their excellence and true nature. So I think that is an obstacle. I think people just are lazy about the way that they approach the whole concept.
I'll address the second one then and say that there are other options available. There are not thousands of them in the neighborhoods that we're talking about, but the first one would certainly be credit unions, if possible. Find a credit union, help someone find a credit union because of the way they're regulated and because of their need to be community-centered. They have loans available that are at more reasonable rates. And in many instances, churches looking to have a response to this have partnered with the credit union to help people go there first or to bail them out of these terrible loans. There are some new centers springing up in Texas, I know, called the Community Loan Center that are employer-based models. So if you, let's say, work for the city, you can get a loan at one of these places that then deducts it from your paycheck, but at a reasonable rate. And we're talking about loans of $1,000 with a year term, not 2 weeks, and at something like 17% interest. And finally, there's a Pew survey of borrowers who, this notion of shame, I think, is very important. I think the payday lenders profit off of the shame. In other words, borrowers want to avoid having to ask their parents for money, ask their brothers for money, pawn their TV, ask their church for benevolence funds, and so they go to a friendly, anonymous payday lender, and after paying and paying and paying and getting in this hole, they turn to one of the sources they could have in the first place to get out of that hole. And so there are other options available. And finally, these places haven't been around forever. People seem to get along beforehand when loan sharking was still illegal.
Katie, maybe you could talk about some of the examples from other places around the country at this point, like the group in Grand Rapids or the...
Yeah, similar to what Stephen was saying, there's a lot of churches and faith groups who are partnering with local banks or credit unions. So there's one in Grand Rapids in the book. Claudette, the woman who was initially trapped in the loan, has been a key part in launching this loan pool. And what they do is, offer low-interest loans to these folks, and they also offer them not only financial literacy, but care as compassionate Christians, people who really care about these people and are invested in them, and if they're struggling, work with them through the struggles, and don't refer them to a second loan. So I think there really are some good examples. There's a need for more of those good examples, but it's encouraging.
Everywhere that we've been talking about this, we've had some opportunity to talk to business students. And one of the things that's been really interesting is that students and professors have sort of taken this up as a challenge, particularly people who had some history in the banking industry, of thinking about ways that they might come up with additional responsible credit options. And so I think with the kind of talent that you have here in this institution and community, I would put that challenge before you as well. And maybe we can get some communities together learning from each other about what can be done. We've got a room full of young adults. What would you give as an exhortation to these folks about this issue in particular, besides not taking a sabbatical from politics?
I would say, get involved. Talk to people. You're probably out there volunteering, doing mission work through your churches, other organizations. Get to know the stories of folks. And the other thing I would say is, when you start hearing about this issue in the public, if there's a debate, if you hear about it in the news, lenders and those that represent them like to make it really complicated. It's not that complicated. 450% is as bad as it sounds. Don't let them complicate you on this. And I would say the main thing to take away is that this, as Mr. Gerson said, is built upon a trap. That independent research shows that 75% of the fees that they make off of these folks come from about half the borrowers that have 11 or more loans a year. One way that I know that's where their profit is that I've never seen in my years of working on this any payday lender or their lobbyists or attorneys that will agree to do anything enforceable to stop that. The cycle of debt, people getting trapped, is not an unfortunate side effect for a handful. It's the heart of the business model. And as you think about this more and you hear more about it, don't let it get more complicated than that.
Yeah, I would encourage you to start the conversation in your community, in your church community, or perhaps wherever the Lord is leading you to do that. One exciting thing for us that we're seeing at the Chalmers Center is that churches are engaged. They're starting to become active, socially active in this sphere. The friend that I mentioned, Jared, who did take the 458% loan, we had about 10 or 12 folks come around him, and help to undo that and help to counsel him. And it was a real learning opportunity for all of us in that. So that is happening. It will be tough work. A lot of times vetting relationships with financial institutions will be work that you have to do with your low-income neighbors. We've found, even mainstream banks are not all friendly to low-income people, unfortunately, which is why when you go in the payday lenders and there's free popcorn and coffee and they know you by your first name, it's a good incentive for people to come back. Now, there are banks and credit unions that I've found in Chattanooga that will work with folks. And so finding and bridging folks to those good financial relationships is a key role that you can play. I would say to prepare yourself, because it gets messy when you get involved in people's finances. It touches a lot of their relationships. and a lot of other parts of their lives. So be prepared for that, but also be encouraged. We're seeing sites, Faith and Finances sites, about 600 of them around the United States that are engaging on this issue. People at all income levels coming together and being challenged and transformed to think differently about what economic flourishing looks like. I mean, we're seeing churches do this in jails, with immigrant communities, in rural areas, in trailer parks, with ex-felons, with homeless folks. The possibilities are really endless because there's a lot of people that have been burned by the financial system, but the church, when it is the church, has a key role to play in that.
We've been at several college campuses, and often people say, why are you talking about payday lending to college students? It's not the most social justice issue. I think a lot of times there's a tendency for folks to latch on to those issues where there's t-shirts and bumper stickers and things like that, and as far as I'm aware, there's not any yet for this issue. Could be. So first of all, I thank you for being here and for being interested enough to come and hear about this. And I think for young people in particular, it's just a really clear example once you learn about the industry of routine and systematic predatory practices on our neighbors and bother you. So so I do encourage you to kind of pursue this locally and in your own state and find out what's happening here. How can I get involved? How can I advocate, whether it's on the Hill or to your friend or your roommate, and telling them about those storefronts is actually doing. So
I'd only add that what you see on cable television is not politics, or at least it doesn't exhaust the meaning of politics, which is different. If you watched the Pope go to speak to the U.S. Congress, he reminded people that politics is a noble calling, and the reason is because it concerns the common good. And that is a great contribution and distinctive, that you're concerned about the whole, not just your own interests. And I think that that is really one way that Christians demonstrate their faith in the world, is by being concerned about the whole. And so the common good is, I think, a very important principle for Christians, and it dignifies the effort of creative public policy. I've just seen people who have pushed ideas and who have really made a difference in the lives of others through politics. It's really possible to do that. It's happened again and again. And not just politics in the sense of running for president or big politics, but really community organization and giving people who don't have a voice. And so that is what politics can do in circumstances.
Great. Okay, now it's time to turn to you. You've been great listeners. Now you get to ask some questions. I have 3 very, very important rules for the questions. First, please share your name when you ask your question. If a person who you're directing your question to, if you would just tell them that this is a question for them. And then the most important rule, ask your question in the form of a question. All right. Mackenzie, and I'm sorry, I can't even see you, have your phone. So raise your hand, I'll give you a call. Okay, all the way down front. Right here.
My name is Michael Taft, and I was just wondering, you've talked a lot about the importance of local communities in this effort, and I understand that's really important. But has there been any exploration of the of online resources and that kind of thing? Especially, I know Quicken Loans and that kind of thing has a mixed reputation, but with the huge expansion of loans online, has there been any thought into using that as a way to get into resource poor areas? And that's a general question for everybody.
Well, I would say, I don't know too many personally. I think rather than just online, mobile payments and mobile lending might be something that comes along that hopefully can help this, although I've received a text message saying, reply for your $500 loan. You know, certainly industry practices are going in that direction, which is disturbing. I know there are a few lenders out there that I've heard of. Progreso Financiero in the Hispanic community in California and Texas is using a different way of evaluating credit worthiness other than, you know, your credit score from those companies, based more on social factors to get loans of more reasonable rates with lower risk to folks. And I think they're relying on more you know, social media and that thing. So hopefully there's someone that can step into that space and provide something positive, because we know lenders are working on it as well.
Over here. Right here. Down in front, 2 rows.
Hey, my name is Alex Cullen. This is to whoever feels they want to answer this, but I was just curious, from like a biblical perspective, where do you draw the line between like an adequate compensation for risk and like taking advantage of people? So like in a policy, from a policy standpoint, like where would you advocate like capping the interest rate?
So I think nationally, Stephen, you would correct me, but I think 36% is kind of the standard that reform efforts are looking at, which obviously sounds high and is high, but is a good starting point, I suppose.
Yeah, I would say if you can't make money at 36%, you ought to look at your business model a little closer. I would also say, regardless of a number, I think it is, when is the transaction mutually beneficial? Is, you know, for so many of us have all kinds of loans, student loans, maybe in the room, car loans, mortgage loans. You get a big chunk of money, you pay a little bit back over a long period of time, you get the education, you get the car, you get the house, and eventually they make a profit based on that time. When it is a lump sum in 2 weeks, that's a different scenario. And so I think, you know, trying to determine when one person's going to benefit way more than the other is where that line is drawn, depending, I don't know, regardless of the number or rate.
I would just add, you know, simple for me recently in thinking about these kind of things is looking at some of the Old Testament laws that God set up about Jubilee, Sabbath, and gleaning, and those kind of things. And all of those laws that he gave to his people were really designed so that there would be flourishing, there would be shalom in all areas. And so, you know, so for business, for farming and gleaning, it wasn't that you weren't allowed to make a profit. You could make some profit, but we were supposed to bend our economic model towards justice and ensure that everyone, the immigrant and the widow and the sojourner, had us in these situations. And so always looking to those, I think, for maybe not the number, won't be there exactly, but the principles of how we can work towards models for doing business or lending that incorporate social justice.
Thank you. You guys have really bright lights here, I gotta tell you. This gentleman over here.
I read in an article recently that 62% of Americans have less than $1 in their savings account. So I commend you on your financial literacy effort. This is probably going to sound like a statement, but I promise I do have a question. The CFPB put out a report, which you'd mentioned, the government agency, that in 2012, banks charged $32 billion in overdraft fees, and that represented that they were typically outstanding for about 3 days. An average overdraft item was $24, and the average fee was $34. So the fee was more than what was overdrafted. And they equated that to 17,000% APR. I looked up a website for a local bank here, a regional bank that operates here, and they'll charge $36 per overdraft up to 6 times a day. And that's per day, which would equate to $216 per day if they overdraft. And based on the CFPB, that gets repaid back to the bank within 3 days. I'm familiar with payday lending, and it ends up being a less expensive alternative to overdraft. Why not? I mean, that seems like the gorilla in the room as far as addressing what banks are charging when it's $32 billion a year. And our Naval Credit Union charged $75 million last year to our naval officers for overdraft protection and made $718 million of net income for the year. So they didn't even have to charge overdraft to be profitable. So it seems like overdraft and the excessive cost of that creates the demand for payday. So why not go after overdraft and reduce the demand?
I would say that I'm not certain that overdraft isn't a problem either. We ought to be talking about that. Also say that when a payday lender hits an account because they have the check or the automatic draft, and if there's not enough in it, then those type of fees are going to be charged. So in other words, payday lenders often create those fees themselves. And so I find it interesting when I hear payday lenders, go to how bad overdraft fees are when their practices often cause overdraft fees as well. And there was a report not too long ago that banks were sometimes refusing to close accounts for folks who were struggling with these loans because they were making so much. So in other words, payday lenders were helping to generate these fees for banks, and I think that's problematic as well.
This gentleman right here.
Hi, my name is, and I'm a student at Covenant, but I'm also a reporter down the mountain. And recently I've been beginning to work on a project on poverty and homelessness and the near homeless in Chattanooga, which is actually a huge problem here as it is pretty much everywhere else in America. But one thing that I've received from these conversations is that a lot of people have talked about something that you guys have addressed tonight, which is that oftentimes, though there are good alternatives provided by religious organizations, churches, wherever, they often refuse to take advantage of those services simply because they are religious and there is a stigma attached to them. So my question is, how can we, as members of those religious organizations, begin to really change that stigma and open up avenues through which people can use these things appropriately?
How do we change people's level of trust with people of faith? Is that the question? Any pastors in the room want to help us with that?
It is a problem that churches are heavily divided by class and heavily divided by race. And so a lot of people have religious experiences where they don't have much diversity of social experiences. And that's not always true, but it's often true. And that strikes me as a difficulty. So it's a much deeper issue about how the church reflects the community and the kingdom of God rather than the class of the people who go there. I think that type of social integration would go a long way towards causing people to be more empathetic.
Yeah, that's a huge question. You would get lots of extra credit if you could answer it. None of you are here for extra credit, I know. I think, man, that's one thing that we've found in doing financial education with churches who want to do this with low-income people is that, well, first of all, a lot of folks are saying, even theorists are saying, financial education doesn't work right? New knowledge, people know and hear new knowledge, but it doesn't change their practices. It actually doesn't work unless it's embedded into a structure of relational accountability, where people are really transformed essentially through new relationships. But the question is, how do you do that? How do you create that? Especially in a society where we are increasingly segregated now by income more and more. The neighborhood you live in is more and more likely to reflect your income level than ever in the past 5 or 6 decades. Where increasingly our churches, our communities are being polarized. How do we address this? How do we begin to build relationships across socioeconomic lines? It's a huge question. That's something that we're really challenging churches to think about. It's not just a class, but how do we live out the down kingdom of God among the margins where Jesus became incarnate? How do we begin to flip that upside down so that we can truly become the church again amongst the poor and begin to see some of that social redistribution, that social capital, relational capital, and ultimately spiritual capital redistributed among people who wouldn't be talking to each other otherwise? It's a great question. That's all I got.
Right in the middle.
My name is Blake Bozarth. I want to thank all of you guys for sharing tonight and also for your advocacy and your leadership on this. It's awesome, so thank you from me. I'm wanting to know more about the economics of this, and so like when you make a statement like you should easily be able to make 30%, you should be able to make money with a 30% rate, and it sounds that way to anybody, I guess I'm trying to understand what are the challenges that you actually face in the public policy area. So is it just simply that they have money and they're lobbying, or what is the economic case that they're making? And if you can make money at a 20% interest rate, why isn't the market doing that? So why aren't people coming in and undercutting current payday loans? And is there maybe it's a long question, but is there maybe a nonprofit spin on this where dealing with this segment of the population, you realize you have high default rates, but you're kind of subsidized in a way, but it does take out it takes out the competition of the traditional payday folks.
Yeah, that's a lot of questions. I'll try and maybe take one or two of them and see if whatever I miss, somebody else can pick up. But the first one, as far as setting interest rates and what can someone make money at, I think part of the problem of these businesses in particular is often this is the only product they have. They're operating a storefront, they're paying overhead, they're hiring people, and they're offering one product. That doesn't happen too often in this way. And I would say it's not just 36%. There was the finance code where I'm very familiar with says a 2-week $300 loan, the limit is 154%, and they said they couldn't make money at that. So, trying to figure out how someone does or doesn't make money, it's hard for them to tell you that. I will say that typically interest rates tied to risk, right? If you're bad credit, riskier borrower, you're going to get a higher interest rate. If you know what someone's getting paid, when they're getting paid, and you have automatic access to the checking account, I would argue there's not a lot of risk in there. If you have the title to their car in your office and you know and you could take it, that's not a lot of risk. And so that doesn't seem to be tied here either. As for the competition, I think that is one of the best questions. Why doesn't somebody go out there and do a 200% loan and undercut them and people go there? It is because people are not competing based on price. That is one to not see in all their marketing studies. I bet you they didn't see, here's how much this loan costs. It's in the fine print, it's in the paper they sign, but they're competing primarily on location, speed, amount, availability, things that are not typical. If you feel desperate and you have nowhere else to turn, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe you're just trying to find the first place that you come to. And I think that is why market forces aren't driving this down. I know in many places, the more payday lenders are, the higher the rate is. They're feeding off of one another. You take out one and to pay off another. The market is not working. They're not driving down, which is why, another reason why I think there is a place for the government to step in and saying something's not operating correctly here.
One of the things we've talked about is that on its own, it's not a great business model, and the way the industry thrives, succeeds, is the turnover of loans. So on average, people are taking out 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 loans a year, and that's where the revenue is really coming in. And we've seen, you can look online, there's several storefronts, one in particular that in their training manual is a cycle, and it shows the employee how to take your customer through the cycle to a new loan. So it's not an accidental thing that's happening.
Right there.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Coates, and I wanted to ask a question to all of you guys. Associated with the stigma attached to religious organizations, there also seems to be a problem with more limited resources that lead to caps on how many people they can help. So obviously one solution or pathway forward would be to encourage more church members to give more generously. I don't think that's probably the only problem limiting religious organizations in helping people. So what are some of the other issues that you think need to be dealt with in order to make religious organizations and community-based organizations better resources for these low-income people?
I don't know that I have a solution answer to that, but I will say, if a church feels like it needs to become a financial lender, that tells you how bad the problem is. Churches are not set up to be financial institutions. There's a lot of rules and regulations that go along with that, very good reason. And so I don't know that an average church with 100 members can pool their resources and become a lender. That's difficult. And I think that's why more success has been seen when they partner with a credit union, someone who knows how to go about that and is chartered to be an investment in a good place for the community itself.
Yeah, I would add too, one of our sites here, one of our Faith and Finances sites is present tonight. You might want to ask Shad and Melissa here, raise your hand, for some advice on. But what they've done is they've taken Faith and Finances and tied it to their benevolence policies at their church. So if someone comes to them with an emergency need for money, they can tell you more about the logistical details of how they work that out, but they will help them, but they connect them into a process of financial education and come around them in that way. So if the person really does want to get out of that cycle, they've kind of created an on-ramp for them. It's pretty innovative, so talk to them afterwards if you want to learn more about that.
Yes, and we'll take one more question after this one.
My name's Sarah Bells. Michael, you talked about the growing wealth gap, and one of the things that we're seeing empirically is just that married couples accumulate wealth a lot faster than anybody else. And so I'm wondering, in the pursuit of creating financial stability for low-income people, how much does social policy play a role in that? Is that a primary goal, or is that kind of tertiary after regulating interest rates and that kind of thing?
Well, obviously that's a big question. The other thing about Bob Putnam's book that's interesting is his profile of Port Clinton, Ohio, which is his hometown. And it's a place where the blue-collar economy essentially collapsed over the course of 2 decades. And they went, over the course of 2 decades, from the 70s to the 90s, from having half the national rate of out-of-wedlock births to having double the national rate of out-of-wedlock births. There were cultural changes that took place in that period, but I find it challenging, just as someone from a conservative background, that you can't explain what went on there. This economic circumstances create highly stressed relationships, highly stressed parenting. There's a lot of good research on that. And it's, so I think the decline, a broad decline of decent paying, low-skilled jobs has been a serious factor in all of this, okay? At the same time, as you've had the atomization of communities, which are less effective. At the same time that you had cultural ends of the, that separate child rearing from wedlock. And when all those things kind of jumble together, they're kind of mutually reinforcing, and you get a very bad cycle. You see the result in places like Port Clinton, where you have all those things taking place at the same time. So when Putnam talks about that problem, so that's the problem, but he talks about it as, he calls it a perfectly perfect purple problem, meaning that people from red states have insights into the nature of the problem, and people from blue states have insights into the nature of the problem, and that you need to do public policy across the range of human need, and that requires you to go beyond traditional ideological categories. The difficulty, though, which we found in the Bush administration, is when you try to do direct family encouragement of marriage and pro-marriage programs and government approaches. We did several, and then the data came back that they were not very effective. And so maybe there really is a division of labor there. It's very hard, once they're undermined, for the government to reconstruct some very basic institutions. It's very difficult. And that requires other institutions that have a higher standing, moral standing, and offer grace, and offer redemption, and offer healing. So I think we ought to have pro-family policy. I think that family decline has been part of our problem. But I think we probably need, there's not one answer to that question. It's a very complex problem, and is likely to have a very complex solution.
I would just add that's a question, and a quick plug for our book is that is a common thread and theme throughout every chapter in our book. Some are more obvious than others. We have a chapter on early childhood development, the foster care to sex trafficking pipeline. There's huge, the importance of a stable family unit or thereof is a really pivotal piece in the lives of a lot of young people, and for better or for worse. So that's a common thread that we see.
It's our last question. Up here in the front.
Hey, I'm Molly Holsey, and I'd just like to ask for whoever would like to answer. What have you typically found to be the demographic from which those who start or own payday lenders come from? And if there's a way to prevent that by getting that particular group of people and trying to dissuade them from starting companies like that?
That's a genius question. I have never seen a survey of payday lending owners. I've seen borrower surveys that talk about who takes it out, but never one that owns it. But I will say that I think, sadly, to some extent, the church is complicit in this problem from the outset. That if we did a better job as the church teaching the morality of business, of what you do Monday through Friday, and how you conduct your affairs spiritually, matters to your faith, maybe there would be less folks deciding that that's the business they ought to be getting into.
Good. All right. I want to thank our panel. And thank you very much for your great questions. We were joking around at dinner that Covenant students are my favorite not just because I hired a Covenant student, but you guys are great. They were great questions. Thanks so much. We have free copy book for students. Now, here's how you get your free copy. You have to fill out a little card for us with your contact information, and then Katie's going to tell you more about shared justice so we can keep in touch. But we promise we won't spam you or try and loan you some money. Folks who are not students, we are a nonprofit organization, and we have a lovely young Covenant student out there who is selling our book, and we would be happy to sell you one this evening as well. And you have, unlike our last event, you have all 3 authors in the room, so you can play author bingo and see who could get all the 6 first. So thanks so much for being here tonight. We hope we've started a conversation, and we'll look forward to spending some more time with you.